The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow across the royal palace. The towering stone walls stood strong, untouched by time, while the manicured gardens stretched out on every side like a perfect painting. In the heart of this grand estate, a single figure stood still, motionless. He was the royal guard, his uniform spotless, his posture straight, and his gaze unwavering. It was a position of pride, one that had been passed down through generations. The royal guard had always been the symbol of duty, loyalty, and discipline. He was more than just a man in uniform. He was the protector of the crown, a living embodiment of the palace's strength and history. This particular guard had spent years training for this very moment. From the moment he had entered the Royal Guard Academy as a young man, he had been taught that his purpose was clear. He was to protect, without hesitation, without distraction. His training had been grueling. Every movement, every action had to be perfect. They taught him to stand still for hours without a single shift of his weight. He learned how to hold his stance even in the coldest winds and the hottest days, how to keep his face expressionless, even when his body begged for rest. There was no room for weakness in his world, only strength, focus, and duty. But being a royal guard wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about mental toughness. He had learned to shut off the world around him, blocking out every noise and every movement. His job required him to be aware of everything, but at the same time, nothing could distract him. People came from all over the world to visit the palace. Tourists walked past him every day, snapping pictures, whispering in awe, or simply gazing at the towering palace gates. But none of them mattered. To him, they were nothing more than fleeting images, passing by as quickly as the wind. His eyes never wavered from his position. His gaze stayed focused, locked on the horizon where the ornate palace doors loomed in front of him. Day after day, he stood in the same spot. The hours seemed to blend together. His only companion was the sound of his own breathing, steady and rhythmic. Over time, his movements became second nature. Even when the crowds grew larger, or the sounds of the city around him grew louder, he never faltered. People who had visited the palace many times had come to recognize him as a fixture of the place, a part of the royal landscape, just like the stone walls or the marble fountains. To the tourists, he was a symbol of something greater, of tradition, of order, and of an age-old ceremony. But for him, there was little sense of ceremony. It was simply his job, a job that required him to be perfect every single day, without exception. He didn't question it. He didn't have time to wonder why he did it. It was just what he had been born to do. Every morning before dawn, he would report for duty. The same routine, the same faces, the same rigid rules. There was comfort in it, a quiet certainty. But there was also a deep nagging feeling, a longing for something beyond the palace walls. Yet he never allowed himself to dwell on such thoughts. His duty was clear, and there was nothing more important than that. It was a matter of pride. He had been chosen for this role, and he would do it as perfectly as it had been taught to him. He had heard stories of other guards who had failed in their duties, guards who had let their emotions slip, or who had been distracted by the chaos of the world around them. He had heard about the consequences that followed when a guard faltered. It was something that haunted him in the quiet moments between breaths. The days often blended into each other. It was easy for him to lose track of time. The changing of the guards was the only thing that marked the passing of hours, but even that was a small, mechanical part of the routine. The world outside continued as it always had, while he remained stationed, unwavering. People came and went. Children smiled at him, pointing, wondering why he never moved. Tourists posed for photos, some even trying to make him smile. They didn't understand. They didn't realize that smiling or showing any emotion was a violation of the code. They didn't see that every second he stood there perfectly still was an act of extraordinary discipline. There were moments when he felt the weight of his role more than others. He would hear stories from the city about people living full lives, experiencing joy, adventure, and freedom. They traveled the world, met new people, and shared in the beauty of the world outside the palace gates. But that world was not for him. He had made his choice, or perhaps it had been made for him. He was a royal guard. His life would always be confined within these walls. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy his duty. He did. There was pride in being part of something greater. There was honor in knowing that he was part of a long lineage of guards who had served the royal family. But at times, When the palace grew quiet and the sun began to dip below the horizon, he felt a strange emptiness in his heart. He never allowed himself to dwell on these feelings, though. He didn't have the luxury to wonder about his life outside the walls. His place was here, standing as a symbol of strength, loyalty, and discipline. Still, there were moments when he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest. There were moments when he wished he could be like the people he saw walking by, people who seemed so free, so alive. The tourists who laughed, chatted, and moved with a kind of joy that felt alien to him. He had spent years perfecting his stance, perfecting his expression, and perfecting the art of ignoring the world around him. But deep down, he wondered what it would be like to step out of his role, to experience the world in the way that they did. But he knew those thoughts would lead nowhere. The royal guard did not have the luxury of curiosity. His job was to protect, to stand firm, and to maintain order. So he did every day. He watched the seasons change, the crowds come and go, and the world beyond the palace move on without him. But he remained, a silent sentinel, guarding the gates of a royal family he would never know. It was during one of these quiet moments, as the sun hung low in the sky and the world around him seemed to slow down, that something unexpected happened. A woman appeared in front of him, breaking the usual rhythm of the day. The air seemed to shift as she approached, and for the first time in a long while, the guard felt his focus waver. It was a small moment, nothing compared to the grand scale of his duty, but in that split second he realized something. The world outside the palace walls wasn't as distant as he had once believed, and that moment, that fleeting interaction, would change everything. The woman walked slowly, her feet crunching on the gravel path that led toward the grand gates of the palace. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. The palace loomed ahead, its stone walls gleaming in the sunlight. It was an imposing sight, a symbol of history and power, yet for the woman walking toward it, it felt different, like something more personal, something more important. She glanced at the package she was carrying, her fingers tightening around it. It was small, wrapped with care in brown paper and tied with a simple twine. The package had been in her hands all morning, and she had carried it through crowded streets, over busy squares, and past curious onlookers. She had been nervous the whole time. It wasn't every day that someone like her got the chance to be so close to the royal palace, to stand at the gates where the most important people in the kingdom passed through. But today was different. Today she had a purpose. Her heart beat faster as she approached the gates. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks. She had heard about the royal guard, how they stood still, how they never showed emotion, and how they were symbols of strength and discipline. The idea of meeting one of them, standing so close, made her feel small. What would she say? Would they let her in? What if they dismissed her or ignored her completely? So many thoughts raced through her mind, but she pushed them away. She had come this far, and she was determined to carry out her mission no matter what. The closer she got, the more she could see the figure standing at attention near the gate. The royal guard, as silent and still as a statue, stood perfectly in place, his back straight, his eyes focused ahead. She had heard the stories about them, how they never moved, how they were trained to resist even the most distracting situations. But now, seeing him in person, she could feel the weight of the discipline in the air. It was a kind of power that came not from the uniform or the weapon he carried, but from the calm presence he exuded. As she approached the gate, she noticed the way the crowd seemed to part around him. Tourists stood a few feet away, eyeing the guard with curiosity, but no one dared to step too close. He was a figure of mystery to them, someone who remained outside their world, untouchable. To them, he was a symbol, of tradition, of the royal family, of the kingdom itself. But to the woman walking toward him, he was something else entirely. He was part of the world she had dreamed of entering, part of the world that she felt so distant from. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her nerves. Her fingers tightened on the package in her hands again. She had no idea how he would react. Would he even notice her? Or would she simply blend into the crowd, unnoticed and unimportant like everyone else who passed through the gates of the palace every day? Just as she reached the base of the stairs leading up to the gate, her eyes met his. It wasn't an intentional glance at first. She had been so focused on the package, on the task ahead, that she hadn't expected to make eye contact with him. But there it was, a brief, fleeting moment when their gazes connected. His eyes were piercing but not unkind. There was a depth to his stare, as if he saw things far beyond the surface. He didn't move, didn't show any sign of recognition, but there was something in his gaze that made her heart skip a beat. For a brief second, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. What was she supposed to say to him? Should she speak, or should she wait for him to acknowledge her first? She had imagined this moment so many times in her head, but now that it was real, she found herself completely unprepared. Without thinking, she lifted the package toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. I brought this for you, she said, holding the flowers out as an offering. They were simple flowers, nothing grand or extravagant, just a bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. But to her, they were the most important thing in the world. She had spent hours picking them, making sure they were fresh and beautiful, hoping they would convey her gratitude. The royal guard's eyes flickered to the package in her hands, and for the first time she saw a subtle change in his expression. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, a softening of his features, a shift in the way he held himself. His posture didn't change and he didn't break character, but something in his gaze told her that he had noticed the offering. His hands remained at his sides, still firm and steady, but there was a slight shift in the air. She held the bouquet out further, her heart racing. I just wanted to thank you, she added, her voice trembling slightly. I know you probably don't get a lot of gifts, but these are for you. For your service. The crowd around her had begun to notice the exchange. People whispered to one another, wondering what was happening. Some pulled out their phones to capture the moment. Others simply watched in quiet curiosity. But the guard stood motionless, still as ever. Yet there was something in the way he looked at the flowers that seemed different. It was almost as if he had never seen anything like it before. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Time seemed to stretch, the world around them fading into the background. The woman felt the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders, but she didn't step away. She couldn't bring herself to walk away, not just yet. She was holding on to something far more precious than just the flowers she was offering. She was holding on to a connection, however brief, that she hadn't expected to find today. And then, as if on cue, the royal guard slowly extended his hand. The movement was small, subtle, but it was enough to make her heart soar. For a brief second, they both exchanged a glance, and in that moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was no palace, no crowd, no rigid rules or duties. There was just the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a silent, invisible barrier. She placed the bouquet in his hand, her fingers brushing against his gloved skin. The touch was brief, but it sent a strange warmth through her. She felt as though she had given him more than just flowers. She had given him a moment of humanity, a break from the unyielding routine he had lived in for so long. He nodded ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the gesture. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But his eyes, those deep, unwavering eyes, seemed to hold a story in them, a story she would never know. And with that, the moment passed. He returned to his usual position, the same stillness, the same unchanging expression. But something had shifted, even if only for a brief second. The woman watched him for a moment longer, her heart still racing. Then, with a final glance, she turned and walked away, the sound of her footsteps mingling with the whispers of the crowd. As she left, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't the kind of peace she had expected, but it was enough. Enough to make her believe, even if just for a moment, that there was more to the world than just the walls around them, more to life than the rules that bound them. More to everything than what they saw on the surface. The woman took a few steps back, her heart still pounding from the moment she had just shared with the royal guard. She could hardly believe what had just happened. It had all felt like a dream, like a fleeting moment that could vanish in an instant, but it hadn't vanished. The bouquet was now in his hands, and in some unspoken way, she had connected with him, even if only for a brief second. Her feet carried her away from the gates, her mind racing. She didn't look back at the palace or the crowd, though she could still hear the soft murmur of voices behind her. It felt as if the world had changed, even if just a little, and she didn't know what to make of it. She had come here with no real expectation of being noticed, just hoping to offer something small, something simple. But what had just happened? What did it mean? Why had he accepted the bouquet? For a long while she walked without purpose, her mind consumed by the moment. She had been to the palace many times before, but never had she felt so close to it, to the life that surrounded it. The royal guard, with his unmoving, stoic presence, had always seemed like a part of something greater, something she could never be a part of. He was a fixture, a symbol, but not a person. At least that's how she had always seen him. But today was different. Today she had seen something more in his eyes. There had been a flicker, a subtle change, something that made her feel as though she had seen behind the mask of his role, even if just for a moment. The question lingered in her mind. Why did he accept the flowers? Was it simply because it was a kind gesture, something that anyone would accept, or was there something deeper? She had seen the way he looked at the bouquet, the way his expression softened for just a second. For a moment it felt as though he had broken free from the confines of his duty, if only momentarily. She hadn't expected that. Not from someone so disciplined, so trained to remain still, to remain untouched by emotion. She found herself retracing her steps, her thoughts still swirling in her head. What if she had imagined the whole thing? What if it had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion, a trick of her mind? Maybe he hadn't really softened at all. Maybe she had just wanted to believe that something had changed. But no, she couldn't dismiss it that easily. The way he had extended his hand, the slight shift in his posture, it hadn't been in her imagination. She had seen it, and it had felt real. As she walked along the cobblestone streets heading toward the square, she realized something. The guard wasn't just a figure of authority or discipline. He was a person just like her. He had a life, a story, and perhaps even feelings. She had always thought of him as nothing more than a soldier in a uniform, a symbol of unyielding strength. But now she saw him as someone who could be touched, who could be affected by simple acts of kindness just like anyone else. She paused for a moment and looked around her. The busy square was filled with people, tourists taking pictures, vendors selling goods, children running and laughing. It was the same scene she had seen countless times before, but now, for some reason, everything felt different. She had walked through this square 100 times, but today, it felt as though the world had opened up in a way she hadn't expected. It was as if her interaction with the royal guard had broken the invisible barrier between her and the world around her. She turned back to the palace, its grand silhouette standing tall against the sky. She wondered if he was still standing there in the same spot, unmoving and unfazed. She wondered if he was thinking about the flowers, about her, or if it was simply another moment in a long line of moments he had experienced. She imagined that for him, it was just another day. He would go back to his training, back to his duties, and the world would continue without interruption. But for her, the encounter had been significant. It had stirred something inside her, a feeling that perhaps there was more to life than routine, more to the world than the walls around the palace. She found herself walking back in the direction of the palace, her steps slower this time, as if the weight of the moment was sinking in. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but something inside her made her want to go back. She wanted to see if the guard was still there, standing in his perfect stillness, or if he had moved on like everyone else. As she approached the gates once again, she saw him. He hadn't moved. He stood exactly where she had left him, his eyes fixed ahead, his face a mask of discipline. But there was something different about the way she looked at him now. He wasn't just a statue to her anymore. He was a person, someone who had been touched by a simple act of kindness. She wondered if he ever let himself feel anything. If, behind his stern exterior, there was a person with hopes, dreams, and maybe even doubts. Did he ever wonder what life was like beyond the gates? Did he ever long for something different? Something more than the unchanging routine of guarding the palace? For a moment she stood there, watching him from a distance. She didn't approach him again, not this time. She had given him the flowers, and she had made her gesture. It was enough. But something in her heart told her that the connection between them hadn't been one-sided. Even if he didn't show it, she had made an impact, however small. As she turned to leave for the second time, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The tension in her shoulders relaxed, and she realized that she had done something meaningful. It wasn't grand, it wasn't life-changing, but it was something real, and that was enough for her. She had stepped outside her own world for a moment and touched the world of the Royal Guard. She had shown him that even in a life so rigid and controlled, there was room for humanity. For a brief moment they had shared something that neither of them could put into words. The guard had accepted the flowers, and in doing so, he had accepted a piece of her world, a world that was different from his own but not entirely separate. She had given him a simple gift, and in return, she had received something just as valuable, a reminder that despite their differences, They were both part of the same world. And as she made her way through the busy streets once more, she felt lighter, as if the weight of the world had shifted just a little bit. It was a small thing, but it had made a difference. And sometimes in a world that could feel so cold and distant, those small moments mattered the most.